She went under with a single, clean arc. The sound of the splash cut the terrace conversation like a thrown stone. Champagne halted mid-fizz. A dozen phones angled toward her as if by instinct. Laughter broke the silence first, thin, surprised, then cruel. Someone hissed a laugh that made a dozen others follow. Water shivered in the pool, and a cream dress clung to the outline of a woman who had not expected to be the night's spectacle. Dr. Isabelle Laurent Whitmore surfaced, hair plastered to her face, mascara trailing like a map of indignation. She came up blinking, composed even as the welt of cold soaked through her clothes. For the briefest moment, the crowd had no script for her. Some widened their eyes, some chewed their own smiles back and pretended to look away. The terrace smelled of chlorine and expensive perfume. A napkin drifted on the water like a pale flag. Chelsea Montgomery stood at the pool's edge, cheeks flushed, fingers curled as if she had been holding a performance. Her husband, Brett, hovered behind, arms loose around a glass he did not yet drink from. The push had been sharp, an elbow, a shove timed in a practiced rhythm. There was the theatricality of it, a shove meant to incite laughter. It landed instead on a quiet, unshakable person. Isabelle had not come to anyone's party to perform. She had come because Victoria, her cousin by marriage and the evening's host, had insisted on a small gathering to mark the reopening of the club's private terrace, a place of pale umbrellas and marble that only very particular people could name without hesitation. Isabelle had arrived in a modest sedan, in a coat she had zipped up against a late spring chill, thinking of nothing but toasts and the cousin's face. She had not brought an entourage. She had not wanted spectacle. Her life, in public and in private, was measured by a different scale, a scholarship program that bore her mother's name, a laboratory that delivered practical clean energy solutions, a company that employed thousands. She carried success like a soft coat, not a banner. She had worn a cream dress that evening because it was simple, and because her mother used to say, "Good clothes are quiet company." That quietness, in the wrong room, reads as an invitation. That is what the people at the pool learned in about 3 seconds. Isabelle surfaced, steadied herself with a hand to the edge. For a second she considered the easiest, loudest thing to do, scream, make them feel as small as she felt. She closed her mouth. Her thoughts snapped like a wire. Let them show who they are, she thought. Let the cameras find their work. A young woman nearby, Sophie Carter, had already raised her phone. Her hands shook. Guilty tremor or righteous anger, it was hard to tell. Sophie didn't yet know the edges of what she had filmed. She only knew what she felt, that an ugly thing had unfolded in front of her, and tiny digital witnesses were more honest than the people who laughed. Marcus, a server in a crisp black vest, was the opposite of those laughing. He moved through the crowd with tray still in hand, because that's what he had been trained to do. Be small, be useful. But when he saw Isabelle knee-deep in the water, he set the tray down and offered a towel without waiting for permission. His palms were steady. For him, there was an old, private debt, the scholarship Isabelle had quietly arranged at his technical school 3 years earlier. He kept the memory like a ledger of obligations he was not obliged to pay back. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was close, careful. He could have asked because of the scholarship. He could have asked because it was the right thing. Truth was, his question held both. Isabelle shook her head. "No," she said. Her voice was low but clear. Once the shock of being pushed turned into the cool clarity of choice, she became meticulous. She accepted the towel and the offered arm and allowed Sophie to film, not as spectacle, as record. Around them, the crowd bifurcated. A cluster of older men exchanged brief, irritated glances, like a nervous committee that had been shoved into a conversation about decorum. A trio of women near a lantern muttered suggestions about ruining an evening, more concerned about the stain on the marble than the stain on a person's dignity. A few younger guests leaned forward, phones held like small evidence. Isabelle could feel eyes like small knives. Some wanted to be entertained. Some wanted to be found amused when a person in the wrong place was made to disappear into a pool. She felt the shapes of assumptions, the ones that fit faces and zip codes and names on a guest list like invisible tags. They slid over her like water. For a moment, there was heat, of embarrassment, of adrenaline. Then there was strategy. She had a list of those who mattered in the room. Victoria, who had invited her, those she knew had records of vulgar comments, the servers who cleaned the plates. She kept the list in mind and let the scene complete itself. A few feet away, Brett Montgomery laughed like a man telling a joke and expecting applause. The laugh had that brittle sound. Rich people's laughter is sometimes brittle because it expects reinforcement from others who cannot afford to contradict it. Brett darted his arrogance like a flag. He'd been taught that scenes get resolved by dismissals or by a quietly offered drink. He had never considered legal consequences. Chelsea, on the other hand, looked delighted, as if this was precisely the evening she'd rehearsed in her head among similarly bored faces. Her mouth opened, closed, mimed apologies that never landed. She stepped back from the edge, and then forward again, the motion of someone eager to complete a performance. Phones multiplied. Sophie's recording, at first a shaky handheld against the swell of elbows, became steadier as she realized what she had captured. Her fingers hovered over the screen, then pressed the record button more deliberately. Marcus, meanwhile, darted toward a manager and whispered something, an urgency that made the manager's eyebrows crease. Security on the terrace had been minimal. The club relied on decorum more than muscle. Still, one uniformed guard tossed his jacket into the tangle and moved toward the pool, a question in his posture. Victoria Whitmore, Isabelle's cousin by marriage, and the woman whose ribbon-cutting speech had opened the evening, fumbled for her words. She had whispered an invite that, in her mind, symbolized connection. Now she put a hand over her mouth and looked at the Montgomerys as if the push were a suddenly visible stain on something she wanted to ignore. She had never meant for her evening to define her this way. Isabelle let the moment hold. She did not claw. She did not break into the crowd. Her left hand smoothed her dress and left a trail of water. Her right hand found her phone in an inside pocket, the metal cool and familiar. She tapped an app, found a contact. Her husband had told her earlier in the week that if anything ever happened, call him and he would be there. She wasn't sure how he would arrive. She only knew his presence altered how rooms bent around incidents. The elevator of attention moved the way these things always did. From private amusement to organized curiosity to urgent concern when the footage started to leak beyond the terrace. Someone in a tux leaned over and murmured about how the clip would be a disaster for the club. Others, not yet thinking beyond their own comfort, suggested they put it behind us over wine. The man's voice who suggested the wine was called James Rodriguez. He ran security for the estate, more of a caretaker of property and schedules than an enforcer. He pushed a hand through his hair and watched his employees huddle with their phones, as if the cameras were now witnesses of his competence. Isabelle stood wet and deliberate. Inside her mind, in very short sentences, she replayed the path that had led her here not as victimhood, but as evidence of a social pattern. Her mother had told her, "The world will try to teach you your place. Teach them to read your name instead." That sentence now ran quietly beneath the noise. She did not want revenge. She wanted facts to line up. "Excuse me," Sophie called to a man who had laughed loudest. "Do you have that on your phone too?" The man hesitated, then handed it over because someone else in the cluster had already captured multiple angles. The first phone was no longer the only record. Within minutes, there were 3 separate clips of Chelsea's shove. One angle showed Brett's hand bracing her back. The second captured Chelsea's face at the instant she pushed, and Sophie's steadier frame provided the clearest view of Isabelle's expression as she sank and re-emerged. A woman near the food table, an employee named Lillian, suddenly stepped forward to help gather Sophie's footage. Her hands were calloused in a way that said she was used to making things disappear. But tonight, she did the opposite, and held out her phone to Sophie, asking if she could make a backup. Marcus helped collect the devices like a curator assembling artifacts. By the time the first security guard reached them, the video was already off the terrace in the small, inexorable way that things escape. Copied, uploaded, forwarded. A single clip slid into a group chat. That clip became a clip of a clip. It would be on a feed by the time someone thought to speak to the police. "Sir, please," the guard began, which was the standard opening for many guards trained to de-escalate. The audience, unsure whether they were supposed to scatter or assemble, flung choices into the air like leaves. A man near the bar muttered, "This will ruin them," referring not to the actors but to the club's reputation. His concern betrayed which loss he feared more. Someone in the periphery had quietly dialed the non-emergency line for the city's private security liaison. And then, because a private event on a private terrace had turned public, someone else dialed 911. The operator on the other end spoke measuredly into the line, collecting words that would turn into statements. Isabelle answered questions the way she answered lab reports, with patience, with evidence, not with theatrical pleas. She described the shove, the feel of the pool lip under her fingers, the sound of laughter. When the dispatcher asked if she wished to press charges, she said yes. Her voice never rose. It was an act of clarity more than anger. Within minutes, a patrol car idled at the club gate, lights muted but present, because for many incidents the mere sight of law enforcement changes the angle of a room. Officers stepped into the terrace like excused guests who had taken off their coats and found a room already disturbed. Officer Kim, young and sharp-eyed, moved to collect the phones. Officer Patterson, older and careful, started to take statements. James Rodriguez approached them with the air of a man who manages people for a living and who had suddenly been asked to manage a catastrophe. Isabelle watched the officers with an almost clinical attention. She answered their questions about the shove, pointed to Chelsea and Brett, pointed to Sophie with an acknowledgement that had nothing of gratitude. She described the loss of composure more than the bruise, though a purple bloom soon marked her forearm where an indignity had pushed into bone. The officer wrote it down. The note became a legal thing before it became anything else. "Do you want medical attention?" Officer Kim asked. Isabelle shook her head. "Not now," she said. "But there is a towel. We can document it." Sophie handed her phone over, and Officer Kim made a copy. The phone's screen reflected Sophie's face, set and alert, like someone who had stepped into a role without prior rehearsal. Marcus gave an account of what he had seen. James produced a tentative, embarrassed statement about the security lapse. Victoria slipped a palm over her mouth and gave a softer, trembling recount of how she had invited Isabelle, as if that action might absolve her. Meanwhile, the clip had already jumped from a private thread into public waters. It fluttered first through a circle of acquaintances, then splashed into the city's feeds. Within an hour, the event's name, the club's name, and the phrase used by the laughing trio would be a trending line. People in other parts of the city who did not know any of these faces would have opinions anyway. In the modern age, the pool had become an altar where private cruelty could be converted into public currency. Isabelle felt that conversion happened. Private injury transformed into public record. She did not like the exposure. The image of her in a wet dress was not one she would ever choose to circulate, but she believed in the ledger of fact. She thought of Marcus and the scholarship ledger she had started the year her own company grew large enough to matter. She thought of Lillian and the way service workers bear witness to evenings wealthy people forget. She called one person first, her husband. Alexander Whitmore answered on the third ring. He had been out of town for the weekend on a scheduled board meeting and, per his habit, had been removed from the cocktail chatter of the club's members. When Isabelle told him, his voice changed. Short, calm, and full of a different kind of power. "I'm on my way," he said. There was no question. There was precision. There was authority. It helps to say at this point plainly, Alexander Whitmore is the owner of the club. He is not merely a husband who reads the room. He holds title, stake, and responsibility here. His name is on plaques in the foyer. When he arrives, he will arrive with the ability not to cancel a sentence but to turn attention. Part of the reason the story shifts when he appears is not only because he is her husband, but because the building, the terrace, and the protocols inside it answer to him. That is a fact of the night. It matters. He arrived sooner than polite expectation allowed. An SUV drew up at the club's circular drive, and James Rodriguez met it with a gait that mixed duty and relief. When Alexander stepped out, his presence changed the terrace not in the way a celebrity commands a room, but in the way a landlord does. People who owe their positions to him straightened at the thread of his glance. He wore a dark coat that was not flashy. The coat had a sense of being built for command. Alexander moved with a practiced economy, his face registering upset without theatricality. He crossed the terrace with steps that meant he had already made phone calls. He addressed Officer Patterson first, not to override but to ask what had already been done. "What footage do you have?" he asked, voice soft but unyielding. It was the voice of someone used to negotiating access to things immediately. Officer Patterson produced a small recorder and a stack of statements. He was careful of protocol. "We have several witness statements," he said. "A few witnesses recorded the incident. We've made initial copies." Alexander inclined his head and then turned to James Rodriguez. "Security feeds," he said. It was not a command issued in the voice of entitlement. It was a practical instruction. "I need everything from the terrace cameras from 7:20 to 7:40. James swallowed, fumbling a phone. I'm coordinating with the tech team. I can pull the archive." "Pull it now," Alexander said. He did not ask for permission from the police. He asked of the place that answered to him. The request landed like a domino click. In a room full of people used to polite delay, that kind of swift decision is itself a kind of authority. Isabelle watched him. There was gratitude in her, private and light, not relief. Gratitude. She did not need him to fight for her, she could speak, but she knew the way institutions tilt when a titled person speaks. The club, built on a ledger of preferential choices, would now open its records because its owner asked. The police would still do their work. The law did not bend to a man's will simply because he owned marble. But institutions noticed their owner in a way they noticed no single patron. Alexander's arrival would not replace justice, but it would make it harder for the room to pretend this had been an accident. He walked to the nearest security console, and the screen bathed his face in pale luminescence. Cameras caught the pool from several angles. One sat high in a corner, another angled across the bar, a third pointed at the terrace gate. James watched as Alexander spoke softly into his phone, and then issued a single directive. "Hand the footage to Officer Patterson," he ordered. There was a pause. James's thumb hovered. Then he looked to the police, who were making their own requests. When the tape was pulled, someone in the room, an employee, exhaled. The sort of breath that said a secret was now plain. The footage, once liberated, would change the tenor of any claim that this had been a misunderstanding. While the security feeds were being accessed, a different channel of exposure widened. Sophie's video, already shared among guests, had been posted by someone onto an app. It picked up small traction, first among friends, then among strangers who knew these things mattered. By the time Alexander walked toward the console, an incoming reporter's alert pinged his assistant's phone. The digital world was responding quicker than any of the courteous people present expected. Private events, when mishandled, become public quickly. Isabelle stood a short distance off. She felt the edges of power and the slow, certain reorganization of attention. The pool in front of her looked different now. Not a place that had held laughter, but a place that had held evidence. Water, which had been used to humiliate, now reflected faces that could not pretend they had not seen. It was a small and useful reversal. "Do you want me to read a statement?" a young officer asked. He was careful, new enough to the work that he still honored the cadence of procedure. Isabelle thought of phrasing. She kept her answers minimal. "I'll give you what you need," she said, "and I'll be available for follow-up." When Alexander placed his hand near her shoulder, a gesture that was protective but not possessive, she did not flinch. She accepted the steadiness as another fact. There are different kinds of power. Some are used to obscure, some to illuminate. The first block of witnesses had been gathered, the first copies of footage secured, and the terrace hung in a quiet that was less a return to normal and more a waiting room for consequence. Outside, phones were lighting up with snippets of a scene that promised to ripple. Inside, people adjusted their manners and their narratives as if pulling on different masks. In a corner, Victoria wiped her eyes and Marcus placed a fresh towel in Isabelle's hands. Sophie hovered, hands empty now, feeling the dissonance between having recorded something and having done something. Isabelle's mind cataloged the pieces: 3 phone angles, a security feed, Marcus's testimony, James's reluctant admission of a security failure. She thought about the shape of a case like a jigsaw puzzle. The pieces did not promise justice, but they built the possibility of it. and for the first time since the shove, she let herself imagine the corner of the room where consequences gathered. A reporter in a navy suit cleared his throat and asked a question that, in another life, would have been most people's concern. "Will you press charges?" Isabelle looked at him. She thought of her mother, who had kept records and receipts in a drawer labeled "for storms." She thought of the scholarship letterheads she had signed, and the small, neat delegations she had made to fight inequality. She thought of Marcus, of Sophie, of James and Victoria. She thought of the pool's water, the way its surface could conceal as easily as reveal. She stood, answered with precision, and gave the name and number of the officer taking reports. She did not perform sorrow for cameras. She did not make herself smaller to make them comfortable. "Yes," she said, "I have filed a statement." That one sentence was both an act and an anchor. It would set in motion forms, interviews, a slow bureaucracy of accountability. It would summon a public that wanted to be scandalized and a legal system that moved, often, on the weight of paper and video and witnesses. It would also expose her in a different way, to commentary, to second-guessing, to the small cruelties of strangers who harvest misfortune for clicks. Alexander watched the way the terrace rearranged itself around the consequences he could influence, and those he could not. He had ensured the footage would be in police hands. He had told James Rodriguez to prepare a full inventory of security logs and to make sure nothing was deleted. He had told his legal team to be on standby. None of that guaranteed a particular outcome. It only guaranteed that some doors would be opened. Isabelle understood that privilege could both harm and help. She did not want favors because she was wealthy. She had made a point in earlier years of refusing special treatment in public matters, because equality too often smells like exception. And yet tonight she accepted a logistical advantage that ownership provided. There is a tension there she neither resolved nor pretended to ignore. Ownership gave access to footage. Access could keep the record from becoming a rumor. The scene closed, only for a breath, on Sophie, who walked up to Isabelle and said, "I saved my file in 2 places." Her voice was small. "I can send it to your lawyer." Isabelle looked at her and offered a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she said. The words were like folding a letter into an envelope. They were not spectacular. They were practical. No verdict had been rendered. No headlines had yet declared winners. But the pieces that would make a case were assembling themselves with the slow, inexorable patience of evidence. The crowd, once eager to laugh, now watched their phones flicker with a new currency: accountability. If you've witnessed injustice and this resonates with you, share responsibly. Record what matters. Protect those who cannot speak for themselves. When Alexander left to make arrangements, calling a lawyer, informing his public relations team, instructing James to preserve everything, Isabelle stayed by the pool a little longer. She watched the ripples settle into concentric circles that faded toward the drain. She thought of the way water attempts to erase and the way it also preserves what it holds for a moment before it slips away. She thought about how she would turn this private humiliation into public change, not for herself, but for the ledger of others who did not have her name on their letters. A woman in a navy suit approached and asked for a comment. A man called her name from across the terrace. Voices streamed toward her like a tide. She moved through them with that same measured dignity, answering with facts and refusing to be drawn into spectacle. Her face was wet, her hair flattened, but her posture was a quiet argument. She would not be erased. On the edge of the terrace, Chelsea chewed her lip and looked at Brett. The composure had cracked. The room, which for a few incandescent seconds had seen her as amusing, was beginning to record her as responsible. The distinction landed on her like an accusation. The night had turned out differently than she had planned. Inside the club's office, Alexander's phone lit with messages. Legal counsel on standby, PR's immediate outline, and the first of many requests from journalists. He tapped back concise decisions. He had the power to make bad behavior impossible to hide in this particular building. He also knew influence had its limits. Evidence would have to carry the weight of consequence, not his title. Still, he acted in the gap between privilege and law. Outside, the pool stilled. The initial shock of the shove had given way to the slow work of proving what had happened, and the larger quiet question, what happens when people see and do not act, hung like a soft, uncomfortable fog over the terrace. This was only the beginning. The clip moved faster than anyone in the room could have predicted. It was shared, reshared, screenshot, looped, captioned, argued over. The terrace's private scandal slipped out in pieces. A single angle here, a cropped frame there, until the whole sequence sat undeniable across timelines. The pool that had once been an instrument of humiliation became, pixel by pixel, public evidence. Reporters arrived in small waves. A local reporter first, then a television camera crew whose boom hung over the club's wrought iron fence like an accusation. They asked questions that clipped at the edges of the truth. Were there prior tensions? One asked. Is this an isolated incident? Asked another. The Montgomerys' names trended alongside the club's name and a string of outraged reactions. In the days that followed, journalists did what they are built to do. They dug. Old posts were unearthed. Snide private posts. Comments that revealed the atmosphere that enabled the shove. Former staff members who had once swallowed humiliation for a paycheck began to feel the room shift and, slowly, to speak. A socialite who had once posted a photo of herself at the club with an offhand racist quip had those comments circulated under new light. Everyone who had once been comfortable reading privilege as fate found themselves having to account for words they had left online. Public pressure congealed around facts, 3 angles of video, a server's immediate aid, a security feed that nobody had thought would be shared outside the club, and a clear statement from the woman in the cream dress who had been shoved. It was not the outrage that built the case. It was the pattern the footage revealed. Multiple sources showed the same motion, the shove, the laugh, the moment the crowd looked away and then began to film. That repetition made it proof, not rumor. Police followed the digital breadcrumbs. Officer Kim, who had been one of the first officers on the terrace, handled the case with the procedural rigor she had been trained for. She coordinated forensic copies of the footage, cataloged witnesses, and compiled the statements into binders that looked deceptively ordinary for something that felt enormous. Officer Patterson oversaw the early legal steps, calling in detectives and confirming that the evidence was preserved. The cluster of small acts, the saved phone file, the security archive, the witness notes, formed a lattice the prosecutors could use. At a press conference a week after the push, a district attorney stepped to the microphone and spoke in a voice intended for civic steadiness. Maria Hernandez, the DA whose office handled cases in the county, outlined charges that reflected more than just a moment of cruelty. She announced that prosecutors would pursue assault charges and would seek hate crime enhancements where the evidence supported them. The words hate crime carried a legal weight that matched the public weight of the images. They formalized what many had only felt, that the shove was not a private quarrel, but an act informed by racial contempt. The Montgomerys' legal team went to work immediately, the expected response in a case where status and reputation were at stake. Their lawyers filed motions, requested discovery, and attempted to frame the incident as a regrettable but non-criminal altercation, an argument that relied on minimizing the racial element and on painting the entire event as a misread social exchange. But the footage resisted minimizing. In multiple frames, the shove looked deliberate, timed to make the woman at the center of the room the butt of a joke. Court filings, depositions, and hearings unfolded like a second crowd in which both sides tried to shape a narrative. The defense tried to claim context, an interaction blown out of proportion, but investigators produced emails and social posts showing a pattern of disdain. Former staff testified that the Montgomerys' private behavior had sometimes veered into casual contempt. The club's personnel files showed past complaints and a history of lax security at private events, patterns that may have felt like small administrative oversights to managers, but to the woman who had been shoved they read like enabling. During this period, Alexander Whitmore's role was visible but measured. As the club's owner, he had already ensured that the footage was preserved and handed to law enforcement, a decisive act that altered what might otherwise have been a contest of memories. He had also briefed counsel and instructed the club to cooperate fully with the investigation. He refused to use his title to push for dismissal or to bury the evidence. The choice mattered. Ownership can shelter or expose. He chose exposure. That did not erase the accusation of privilege inherent in his presence, but it made it harder for institutional inertia to hide wrongdoing. The Montgomerys faced not only criminal inquiry, but an unraveling of the reputation that had buffered them. Sponsors and boards that once thanked their donations reconsidered the optics. Invitations that had been issued on embossed stationery began to go unreturned. Wealth in this instance met a limit. Publicity and preserved evidence could produce outcomes that benefactors could not simply buy away. Pre-trial hearings set the stage for a trial in a courthouse that, for weeks, was a theater of legal theater. Journalists lined the halls. Community groups rallied for a fair process. Activists who had watched similar cases buckle under the weight of institutional bias organized support for prosecution. Others warned against trial by public opinion. Isabelle navigated this portion of the story as she had navigated the night on the terrace, careful, purposeful, unwilling to let the story about her become bigger than the facts. She met with her attorneys, and they mapped what she would say and, more importantly, how she would say it. They rehearsed a testimony that would be factual and clear. She had friends who urged her to speak with force, to lean into righteous anger on the stand. Her own inclination was different. She saw the testimony as an extension of the night, an opportunity to make the ledger of evidence clear to people who would not be present when the footage was played. She wanted to be understood, not to perform. Trials do strange things to people. In the courtroom, ordinary rhythms get recreated into ritual. The clearing of throats, the shuffle of papers, the cadence of an objection. For Isabelle, the endurance required was not theatrical but precise. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, with small, quick interior sentences that sharpened her focus. She remembered a chair in her mother's kitchen where, as a child, she had been taught to read a ledger. She thought of receipts and names and the way a signature rendered a thing official. On the stand, she would sign nothing. She would simply bear witness. The prosecution's case was straightforward and relentless. They played the security footage, 3 separate phone angles, and Sophie's steadier clip in succession so the jury could see the event from multiple vantage points. Each angle layered on the others, filling in a picture that matched the witnesses' accounts. The stitching of images, pool edge, the shove, Isabelle going under, the laughter, made deniability difficult. The defense tried several strategies. One was to argue that the shove was an accident, an impulsive misstep. Another was to claim that the defendants were being targeted by public sentiment and that the videos did not capture the social nuances of the entire evening. At times they attempted to paint Sophie as an opportunistic witness. At other times they suggested that the crowd's reaction was misinterpreted. These moves were predictable. They sought to shrink the deed into a misunderstanding. But the witnesses were consistent. Sophie, who had filmed from a few feet away, testified with a voice that trembled only at the memory of the moment and steady otherwise. Her testimony did not moralize. It catalogued. "I saw her go under," she said, and described how she had felt when she realized what she had recorded. Marcus took the stand too. He spoke about the immediate instinct to help, the towel he offered, and the scholarship that had paid for his technical training. Details that wound the case to the human effects of the act. Officer Kim described the chain of custody for the footage and how the security archives matched the phones. These 3 accounts, together with the video, formed the scaffolding of the prosecution's narrative. Isabelle's own testimony was the moment the courtroom held its breath for. She spoke about the shove, the humiliation, and the mathematical clarity of evidence. She explained in the same calm tone she had used to the police why she had chosen to document rather than to fight back. She told the jury about the ledger she kept of good acts and small injustices, about the scholarship letters filed away like receipts, and about the choices she had made in years of building an enterprise that was supposed to broaden opportunity. She described how being shoved cued a memory, not of physical pain alone, but of a long cumulative series of small humiliations that people of color learned to expect. Her diction was precise, her pauses deliberate. The power of her testimony lay in the ordinary details she offered. "Did you feel the urge to retaliate?" the prosecutor asked. Isabelle chose her words. "No," she said. "I felt the urge to preserve the moment, to make sure it wasn't just mine to carry." Legal strategy aside, both sides sought to shape public sentiment. Editorials flew. Op-eds debated the rarity of true accountability. Influencers dissected footage frame by frame. The noise was constant, but in the courtroom the noise was regulated to arguments and evidence. When the jury returned, their faces told none of the story. They were, as jurors must be, a collective instrument of civic calculation. Their verdict, pronounced in a room that had seen much spectacle, was the end of one sequence and the beginning of another. Guilty on all counts, the foreperson read. The words landed like a shutter closing. There was no king's ransom of triumph. The moment of judgment was quieter than some had expected. Isabelle's face did not contort into vindication. She maintained the kind of steadiness she had cultivated for years. The Montgomerys, whose social world had begun to crack, sagged with the real consequence of the law. Their lawyers debated appeals. The public moved from outrage to the more complicated realm of restorative expectations. Sentencing was a procedural matter routed to the appropriate branch of the court. The judge, with gravity that matched the crime, imposed consequences designed both to punish and to signal the social harm of the deed. The court ordered restitution and community service. It imposed criminal penalties consistent with the convictions. The judge's pronouncement read like a civic statement. There are boundaries societal privilege cannot cross without consequence. Beyond criminal sentencing, civil paths opened. Isabelle and her counsel filed a civil complaint that culminated in a settlement, an agreement in which the Montgomerys would make financial reparations and commit to certain community actions. No amount could erase the humiliation, but the settlement included funds earmarked for community programs focused on anti-bias education and scholarships. The legal outcomes were multiple: criminal accountability for the shove, civil accountability for harm inflicted, and a public record that this kind of conduct carried cost. That cost, measured in legal consequences and reputational fallout, was one piece of the aftermath. Another was the conversation that the incident sparked. Meetings convened at the club to reassess security at private events, and training modules about bystander intervention and racial bias were adopted by hospitality groups in the city. The press that had initially smelled scandal began to publish pieces on how institutions could better prevent such harms. Policy conversations happened in the spaces between editorials and legislative hearings. The event had become, for a moment, a catalyst. Isabelle chose to move that catalyst into sustained action. She did not want the story of her shove to be the story everyone remembered and then forgot. She turned to the work she had already been doing: scholarships, funding for minority entrepreneurs, and scaled it with intention. She announced a fund aimed at supporting victims of hate crimes and at underwriting legal defenses for people who could not afford them. The fund also supported programs that trained bystanders to intervene safely and effectively, because, as she had seen, witnesses mattered. At a small ceremony months later, the fund's first grant was awarded to a neighborhood legal clinic that provided pro bono representation to marginalized clients. Marcus, who had once been a server carrying trays and a scholarship recipient quietly supported by Isabelle, spoke about the difference the aid had made in his life. He had gone on to finish his technical program and now worked in a clean energy startup that Isabelle's company had partnered with. He described the scholarship as more than money. It had been a message that someone saw potential where others had seen merely service. Sophie, the woman who had filmed that first clip, found herself traveling a different path. Her clip had been the catalyst. Her testimony had been the steadiness. She used the experience to change careers, entering journalism and reporting on stories of justice and accountability. Her voice, which had once trembled behind a phone screen, now spoke into microphones with a professional clarity, turning an impulsive act of conscience into a vocation. Officer Kim became, in her precinct, an advocate for procedures that ensured evidence preservation in private events. She partnered with community groups to teach officers how to engage with bystanders, so recordings were handled ethically and reliably. The ripple effects of her diligence, how she copied files, cataloged statements, insisted on chain of custody, became a model inside the department. Victoria, who had once invited Isabelle as a symbol of family connection and found herself confronted with the reality of the evening, made a public apology and began participating in talks about inclusion at private clubs. Her gesture of contrition was complicated. Some questioned the sincerity. Others accepted the shift as evidence that social norms could be challenged from within. She publicly committed to supporting the programs funded by the settlement. Not every response was neat. A few in the club's membership resented the changes, seeing them as the cost of attention rather than the correction of conduct. Some dismissed the trial as spectacle, but the institution that had once relied on decorum to suppress conflict could not simply return to business as usual. Protocols changed, invitations tightened, training replaced casual assumption. Even small shifts, like an upgraded security presence and mandatory anti-bias training for staff and guests, made it harder for the same harm to happen in the same way. Isabelle's public statements after the trial were rooted in the same kind of clarity she had used throughout. She said the case was less about her than about the ledger, about making sure that acts of humiliation did not slide into hardship without consequence. She emphasized the need for systemic solutions. She praised the bystanders who had acted, the ones who gave their footage, who testified, who refused to laugh, and called for more people to adopt that posture. Not everyone has cameras, she said at one funding event, but everyone has choices. Her work expanded. The fund created a legal defense pool that could be accessed nationwide, a rapid response team to help victims secure evidence and legal counsel quickly. Grants supported community mediation projects and local organizations fighting discrimination. She partnered with tech groups to develop an archive protocol that helped bystanders store footage in ways that preserved chain of custody while protecting victims' privacy. The goal was practical: to turn the tools of dissemination, phones and social platforms, into mechanisms that could also support fairness. There were symbolic moves as well. Isabelle worked with city leaders to transform the private terrace into an occasional public venue for community workshops. The club, still privately owned by Alexander, agreed to host panels on inclusion and bystander training. The pool that had once been a scene of humiliation became, at orchestrated intervals, a convening place for healing, a setting for conversations about restorative practices, a site for scholarships announcements, a backdrop for the kinds of redress the settlement aimed to create. Some called that reclaiming. Others whispered that it was performative. The truth, Isabelle knew, lived somewhere between the two. Reclamation is not a magic erasure. It is a long, sometimes messy work of recalibration. She meant to do it with humility, and with the heavy, quiet attention of someone who had seen how water erases traces, and how water also reflects back the faces gathered around it. In the months after the verdict, she received letters from people who said the case had made them rethink their own scenes of silence. A server from another city wrote about how he had seen the clip, and for the first time, felt permission to speak up when he witnessed discrimination at his workplace. A teacher wrote that she had used the case as a classroom moment to discuss civil responsibility. Those letters multiplied into invitations to speak, to advise, to partner. When she accepted invitations, she did not adopt the posture of a celebrity victim. She spoke about policy. She spoke about practical measures, how a guard's log could be improved, how clubs could upgrade their camera systems and their retention policies, how private events needed clear protocols for handling reports. She insisted on sober, implementable steps. She wanted her platform to produce durable change. There were personal costs. Being the center of a public case meant living in an odd kind of transparency that had nothing to do with openness and everything to do with being read. Her inbox filled with praise and with vitriol. She received invitations she declined, and offers she accepted only when they aligned with her objectives. Alexander managed the public fallout at the club and worked with PR teams and legal counsel. He continued to be present in ways that supported the institutional shifts she sought. One evening, months after the trial, a small group gathered near the pool. It was not the same guest list that had been there the night of the shove. The group was mixed. Community organizers, server staff, members of the club who had chosen to engage, and a handful of journalists. The pool's surface shimmered under subtle lighting. Isabelle stood at its edge, looking down at the water that once made her an object of spectacle. She thought about the shape of the evening in that quiet way she used when making difficult decisions. There was memory of her mother's kitchen, of scholarship envelopes. There was gratitude for the people who had helped, and a practical reckoning about the work ahead. She spoke plainly then about the fund's intentions and about accountability. "We are not ending something," she said. "We're building systems that make it harder for something like this to happen again. That is not small work." Marcus stood nearby. He looked calmer than the night he had handed her a towel. Sophie sat across from Alexander, now a paid journalist whose byline had appeared in pieces that held institutions to account. Officer Kim listened, notebook in hand, already making notes about the training modules she planned to pilot. At the end of the evening, someone played the clip again, this time in a forum meant for analysis and learning. The sensation in the room was not the same as before. Where there had been spectacle, there was study. People pointed out moments where intervention could have occurred, where security might have acted. They noted where policy could have changed the outcome. The footage that once fueled outrage now fed a curriculum. Isabelle lingered by the pool as others filed out. The water held the reflections of people who had been altered by what they had seen. She looked into it for a long time. In short interior beats she let memory come, of being a child and learning to read her mother's handwriting, of the scholarship letters she had signed in small looping script, of decisions she had made at her company to fund technologies that might lift communities. Those memories were small lighthouses in the broad dark of public life. She used them to anchor action. She knew her choices had been informed both by personal pain and by a belief in the systems that could prevent similar pain. There was no illusion that one case would solve structural racism. The change she sought would be incremental, 1,000 small shifts across institutions. She committed herself to that patient work. The club, for its part, set into motion longer-term changes. It revised its guest policies and instituted a transparent incident reporting system. Security staff received mandatory training on de-escalation and on preserving evidence. The club's board convened a committee focused on diversity and inclusion, an awkward phrase that nonetheless moved conversation forward. These institutional changes were not a cure-all. They were, however, legible acts that made the room less hospitable to the sort of casual cruelty that had allowed the shove. The Montgomerys withdrew from certain social circles. Some former allies distanced themselves. Others remained, convulsed by the legal and social consequences. Their arc, a sudden pivot from privilege to public censure, became a cautionary example. The case did not erase egregious patterns in culture, but it nudged institutions toward accountability. Public discourse shifted in small ways too. Conversations that had once been relegated to silence corners were now part of mainstream debate. How to protect victims who lack resources, how to hold bystanders accountable, how to create quick response legal support for hate crimes, and how to structure private venues so they do not become lawless spaces where humiliation is a pastime. These conversations were messy, contested, and often slow, but they happened. On a crisp afternoon a year after the shove, Isabelle stood again at the terrace, this time before a crowd gathered for the first public workshop hosted at the club. The terrace had been polished and painted. The pool had been drained and sealed with a temporary platform for chairs. Children from scholarships programs sat in the front row. Marcus was there, introduced as a scholarship success story. Sophie sat beside him, now a working reporter. Isabelle spoke without flourish. She told a story not about herself, but about the practical measures the fund had supported. Quick evidence preservation kits for bystanders, a hotline that connects victims to legal counsel within hours, grants for community organizations that provide mediation and restorative services. She named the work and then invited the crowd into participation. It wasn't a speech of triumph. It was a plan. The crowd listened. At the end of the forum, people were invited to sign up for training sessions or to volunteer with community partners. The event did not erase the past. It created pathways forward. A woman in the audience, a server from another venue, approached Isabelle after the talk and asked where she might get such training. Isabelle gave her a card, and the card turned into a dialogue. Outside, the pool glinted in the late light. It had been drained for the event, the tile visible and a little too clean. Isabelle walked to its edge and looked down. She thought of the splash. She thought of the way the world had tried to wash her away, and how instead, she had chosen to make the memory into leverage for something larger. The water's reflection was no longer a mirror of humiliation. It was a page on which new lines could be written. One moment doesn't have to define everything, she told a small group nearby, but one moment can be a hinge. Alexander, standing not far off and keeping to his usual reserve, listened. There was no grand embrace. There was only the small, sure presence of someone who had used his position to open the right doors. He moved in the spaces between institutional power and private accountability. That role was complicated. It was real. The story did not end at that terrace. The fund continued. Grants were awarded, training sessions filled, and small policy changes at a city level were proposed. The Montgomerys appealed their conviction, and the legal processes continued in the slow, patient ways courts always do. Appeals and legal wrangling would not negate the change already set in motion. Isabelle continued her work with a steady focus. She held to the idea that dignity could be defended without descending into spectacle. She believed in the need for systems that made justice accessible, and she invested the same meticulous attention in that work that she had once given to running laboratories and to signing scholarship letters. She named the fund after an idea rather than herself, the Ledger Initiative, because she wanted the emphasis to be on record-keeping, on accountability, on cumulative acts of fairness. Small human gestures continued to matter. Marcus sent updates about his new job at a tech firm that worked on energy-efficient solutions for small manufacturers. Sophie produced a documentary short on how bystanders can preserve evidence responsibly. It aired on local television and was used as training material by community groups. Officer Kim led workshops on evidence chains for officers across the county. James Rodriguez, having seen the cost of inaction, implemented stricter event policies and advocated for staff training in multiple venues. Victoria, in a quieter arc, volunteered at community panels and spoke about how she had failed to foresee the harm her event allowed. The public never united behind a single sentiment. Some still insisted that the whole thing had been overblown. Social feeds sometimes spiraled into the old patterns of quick outrage and then rapid forgetfulness. And yet, in the spaces where work was done, the legal clinics, the training rooms, the scholarship offices, practical change took root. The pool remained a motif. At times it was a reminder of what had been done to humiliate. At other times it became a symbol of reclamation. A year later, a community mural appeared near the club's entrance, painted by local artists supported by a grant from Isabelle's fund. It depicted a pool not as a site of shame, but as a gathering place where hands reached across the water to help one another. The mural was not without its critics, but it signaled a willingness to imagine the space differently. In private, Isabelle still felt the small traces of that night. The memory was a compact thing. The feel of wet fabric, the sound of laughter that had not been compassionate, the swift, clarifying choice to preserve evidence. She used the memory as fuel, not as a burden. She wrote in short, precise lists about the work ahead, the organizations to fund, the partnerships to forge. Her days became sequences of meetings and small gratifications, an application approved, a hotline picked up, a lecture delivered to a group of hospitality managers who had once shrugged at complaints. One afternoon, she received a letter from a woman who had watched the trial from another state. The woman described how she had once been pushed into silence at her workplace, and after seeing the case, had filed a complaint that led to a company-wide review. "Your choice to document made mine possible," the letter read. That sentence struck Isabelle like a confirmation. Her refusal to make herself smaller had enabled someone else to be bigger. The legal machinery continued to turn. Appeals were filed. Newspapers wrote follow-ups. But the immediate practical work of repairing harm and building resilience proceeded in quieter channels. Caseworkers trained, bar associations convened to push for better victim support. Clubs across the city revised their policies. Small acts multiplied. At the end of it all, the legal consequences, the public reformation, the community work, there remained a human core, the person who had been shoved. Isabelle did not claim a simple victory. She did not believe humiliation could be fully undone by courts or by grants. But she did believe in the possibility of converting a private injury into public resources that could protect others. That was the arc she chose. On the anniversary of the incident, the club hosted a day of workshops. The terrace was open to the public. There were stations on legal rights, on first response evidence preservation, and on de-escalation techniques. People who had been peripheral the year before, Servers, cleaners, security staff sat in panels and were heard. The day concluded with a small ceremony by the pool. Isabelle spoke briefly about the ledger, about recording wrongs so they can be redressed, and then stepped back. As people drifted away, she walked alone to the pool's edge. The water was calm. The tile was visible. For a moment she allowed herself a small, private reckoning. This was not the moment that would define her, but it was a hinge that might tilt the world a fraction closer to justice. She looked at the reflection and thought of all the people whose small acts, Sophie lifting a phone, Marcus wrapping a towel, Officer Kim copying a file, had become the scaffolding of accountability. She lifted her chin and walked away from the water. The terrace behind her hummed with the sort of ordinary liveliness she had once sought to avoid when someone else wanted to make her a spectacle. That hum now belonged to a different world, one where people had to answer for what they did. Before she left, she paused and said to a reporter who had lingered too long, "This isn't a single story. It is a call to be the kind of neighbors and colleagues and guests who do not make cruelty comfortable. If you want to help strengthen systems that protect victims and train bystanders, links to legal defense funds, bystander training resources, and community organizations supported by the Ledger Initiative are in the description. Share responsibly. Act when you can. Be a witness who helps, not a spectator who looks away."